Sometimes it's just so overwhelmingly aggressive and out of control. You know, like anybody with a substance abuse problem.
For years, Loni Anderson and Burt Reynolds looked like everything Hollywood promised love could be. However, every great love story has a shadow side. Behind that picture, Loni was carrying a burden, one she refused to speak about until she was finally ready. And before she passed away, the truth came out in full. What was the real reason their marriage ended? A perfect romance on the outside. Burt Reynolds was already one of the biggest names in Hollywood when he walked onto the Merv Griffin show in 1981. He had been a box office force throughout the 1970s, pulling in massive crowds with films like Smokey and the Bandit and Deliverance. He was charming, funny, and confident on camera. That night on the show, he found himself sitting near a woman who caught his attention in a way that surprised even him. Her name was Loni Anderson, and she was already a television star in her own right. Loni had built her fame playing Jennifer Marlowe, the sharp and glamorous receptionist on WKRP in Cincinnati. The role had earned her 3 Golden Globe nominations and 2 Emmy nods, making her one of the most recognized faces on American television. She was known for her smile, her platinum blonde hair, and her ability to carry a scene without breaking a sweat. But she also carried something beneath all of that, a careful instinct about people, shaped by 2 marriages that had already ended before she turned 36. When Burt and Loni met that night, both of them were technically spoken for. She was still married to her second husband, actor Ross Bickle, and Burt was in a well-known relationship with Sally Field. But something was established between them that evening, something that neither of them forgot. Burt made sure of that. He began pursuing Loni almost immediately after their first encounter, and his approach was not subtle. He started sending her flowers and gifts, and eventually surprised her with a Rolls-Royce, a gesture that made headlines and left little room for doubt about his intentions. Loni waited a full year before agreeing to date him. She had been through enough to know that attraction and compatibility were not always the same thing, and her cautiousness stood in sharp contrast to Burt's boldness. By 1982, both had ended their previous relationships, and they finally began spending real time together. What followed was a 6-year courtship that played out largely in public. They attended events together, posed for magazine covers, and became one of the most photographed couples in Hollywood. Their connection had an undeniable warmth to it in those early years. Burt later described reading mystery novels aloud with Loni. The 2 of them curled up together, trying to guess the ending before they reached the final pages. It was a private and tender side of a man who spent most of his life performing for crowds. For Loni, those intimate moments were part of what she fell in love with. He could be loud and magnetic in public, but at home, he was something else, thoughtful, even shy. A reader who loved stories and kept his real self at a careful distance from the cameras. Their wedding in April 1988 was a reflection of everything they had built together. Burt had spent years preparing his 160-acre BR Horse Ranch in Jupiter, Florida, and had even built a small chapel on the property with this event in mind. The ceremony was small by Hollywood standards, with only 65 guests invited. Reynolds' own father gave Loni's hand, as both of her parents had passed away. The reception was held in the ranch's airport hangar, which had been decorated with over 100 trees and tables covered in dogwood and lilac centerpieces. Burt proposed with a custom-designed 7-carat yellow diamond ring that became one of the most talked-about pieces of jewelry in celebrity news that year. Guests who attended the wedding later described the moment as genuinely touching. One of their close friends later reported that the room had cried, that the couple looked like something out of a fairy tale. Loni stood beside Burt in her gown and later said she felt like Cinderella who had found her prince. It was the kind of day that seemed to confirm everything the public had been watching for 6 years. That same summer, they adopted a newborn baby boy they named Quentin Anderson Reynolds. The arrival of their son added another layer to the picture the world was seeing. Both of them stayed up at night, amazed by how full their lives had become. Loni spoke about her son in interviews with the kind of joy that was impossible to fake. Burt was equally proud, and the 3 of them began appearing at public events as a family, always impeccably dressed and always smiling. To anyone watching from the outside, this looked like everything a person could want. What the world could not see was what was already present behind that picture. Burt had been carrying a serious physical injury since 1984. when a steel chair accidentally struck him in the jaw during a stunt on the set of City Heat.
Picked up the wrong chair. He didn't pick up the breakaway. He picked up a real chair and he caught me across the jaw and he broke my jaw about 4 places.
The damage had been severe and the pain had never fully gone away. The prescription medications he had been given to manage that pain had followed him into the marriage, sitting in the background of a life that looked, from every public angle, like the happiest story in Hollywood. But time reveals all truth. Cracks. By the time Loni and Burt had settled into married life, certain patterns had already started to form beneath the surface of their relationship. Burt's jaw injury had never properly healed. He had lost close to 30 pounds during his recovery, was unable to eat solid food for an extended period, and had spent nearly 2 years largely unable to work. During that time, doctors prescribed him a combination of medications to manage the pain and the sleeplessness that came with it. By the time the marriage began, those medications had become a regular part of his daily routine. 3 specific medications later came to light, including a painkiller and anxiety medication. Loni watched this combination take hold over time and later described the changes in Burt as gradual at first, then impossible to ignore. A man who had once been quick-witted and disarming in private began showing another side. His moods became harder to predict. His reactions to small things grew worse, and the bookish man who used to read stories aloud with her in the evenings was increasingly replaced by someone she did not fully recognize. Burt's jealousy had existed before the marriage, but prescription medication use amplified it. He was possessive about Loni's work, her time, and her attention in ways that grew steadily more intense over the years they were together. Loni had her own career and her own identity long before she met Burt. But as the marriage continued, she found it more difficult to maintain that identity. Burt had reportedly not been pleased with the idea of Loni pursuing roles that kept her visible and independent. And there were opportunities that fell through during their time together as a result of the friction at home. Burt also began to complain, privately and eventually publicly, about their finances. He claimed that Loni spent money at a rate he found excessive. He described her purchasing clothes in large quantities, replacing items that had been photographed on her even once, and treating luxury as a baseline expectation rather than an occasional indulgence. His platinum credit card, which reportedly carried a $45,000 limit, was said to have been emptied within 30 minutes on one occasion. The resentment they produced in Burt was real, and it grew. On Burt's side, the financial pressure was also mounting from outside the marriage. His business ventures outside of film, including a restaurant chain, a nightclub in Atlanta, and an investment in a professional football team called the Tampa Bay Bandits, were struggling. His film career, which had been one of the most profitable in Hollywood through the 70s and early 80s, had begun to slow. The combination of declining box office returns and what he saw as unreasonable household spending created a tension that sharpened his mood and affected everything around him. Loni, in the meantime, was managing a situation that went far beyond financial disagreement. She described watching Burt's behavior become frightening. His temper could shift without warning. He was always suspicious about her interactions with other people, and that suspicion was not grounded in anything she had done. She later said that the years before the marriage had already contained signs of his controlling and jealous nature, but that she had interpreted those signs through the lens of passion rather than instability. Inside the marriage, that lens no longer worked the same way. Burt later admitted on Good Morning America that the physical side of the marriage had broken down, saying that the couple had not been intimate for close to 3 years before he filed for divorce. He presented this as evidence of a failing on Loni's part, but the circumstances he described existed inside a home where medication dependency, emotional volatility, and unpredictable behavior had already done much damage. The idea that the marriage's intimacy problems existed separately from those conditions was something Loni would come to challenge in detail. There was also the matter of what was happening to their son, Quentin, who was growing up in this environment. Loni had always placed Quentin at the center of her priorities. He was young, and she was aware that young children absorb the emotional climate of their home even when adults believe they are protecting them. As Burt's behavior became more unpredictable, Loni began paying close attention to how it affected the little boy who was seeing everything. That concern would eventually become the clearest signal to her that the situation had gone past what she could manage or repair. Burt, meanwhile, had reportedly consumed so many pills at the height of his addiction that his physical appearance changed drastically. Those around him watched his weight drop to alarming levels, and there were moments when people close to him feared he might not survive the withdrawal if he ever tried to stop. At the worst point, he had been taking close to 50 pills a day and had looked, by his own description, like a skeleton of himself. All of this was unfolding inside the walls of a marriage that continued to appear polished and intact from the outside. The divorce and the silence that followed. June 1993 began like any other month in the couple's household. Burt had been carrying the weight of the marriage's private collapse for some time, and behind the scenes, decisions had already been made that Loni knew nothing about. She was not prepared for what was coming. There had been no warning, no conversation, no formal acknowledgement that the marriage had reached its end. Instead, what arrived was a set of legal documents and a one-way plane ticket. Burt's chosen method of telling his wife that their life together was over and that she had to leave their Florida home. The shock of that never left Loni. She had believed, despite the difficulties inside the marriage, that there was still something worth fighting for. She had spent years trying to stabilize their home, to manage the effects of Burt's addiction, and to keep their family together in a way that protected Quentin from the worst of it. To have the marriage ended in that way, without a conversation, without warning, told her something about how little weight her own perception of the marriage had carried. Burt's statement through his representative was careful and cold. He said the marriage was irretrievably broken and that his priorities and Loni's had become different. Within days of that statement, he was giving interviews to media outlets in which he denied rumors that he had been unfaithful, calling such claims absolute lies. The gap between those two positions, the formal dignity of the official statement and the aggressive media campaign that followed, would define how the next 2 years unfolded for both of them. Weeks after Burt denied the infidelity rumors, a woman named Pam Seals came forward publicly. She was a cocktail lounge manager at a Tampa restaurant, and she told the press that she had been in a relationship with Burt Reynolds for the past 2 years. The timeline she described placed the affair squarely inside the marriage. Burt's denial had been on record for only a matter of weeks before it collapsed under the weight of that disclosure. He eventually admitted that he was involved with another woman, though he insisted that Loni had been unfaithful first. While all of this played out in newspapers and on television programs, Loni said nothing. She made a deliberate decision not to engage, and she held to that decision under considerable pressure. Burt gave interviews in which he accused her of adultery, called her an unfit mother, and described her financial habits in negative terms. He challenged her publicly to submit to a lie detector test under truth serum, offering to give her everything he owned if she passed, and demanding sole custody of Quentin if she failed. Every accusation landed in print while she remained quiet. The restraint Loni showed during this period was not passivity. She was watching everything that was being said about her, processing it, and making a specific choice about how to respond. She later explained that she had waited 2 full years before speaking because she wanted to write and talk about Burt from a place of clarity rather than anger. She did not want to produce a response that was driven by hurt or by a desire to win a public argument. She wanted to say something that was true, and she knew that the truth required more than the emotion of the moment. That choice came at a cost. While Burt continued to shape the public narrative, Loni watched the version of her that existed in the press become increasingly removed from who she actually was. She was being described as a spendthrift, a bad mother, and an unfaithful wife, all in her own silence. Friends and supporters watched the campaign against her and found it difficult to reconcile with the woman they knew. But Loni held her ground. She had made a decision, and she was going to keep it until she was ready. The legal process moved forward with its own slow and grinding pace. Burt filed in Florida, where the divorce laws favored him. Loni countersued in California, where community property law would divide assets equally. The battle over jurisdiction added another layer to proceedings that were already complicated by the question of custody over Quentin, who had just turned 5 and was caught between 2 parents moving through one of the most public divorces in Hollywood history. The court costs mounted rapidly, and the legal teams on both sides settled into what would become a years-long process. The legal proceedings included ongoing disputes over alimony payments and a custody arrangement that required the two of them to stay in communication long after they would have preferred not to. Burt failed repeatedly to keep up with the $15,000 in monthly child support the court had ordered, and there were times when the mortgage on the house he had been required to buy for Loni went unpaid as well. In September 2015, Burt finally wrote a check to settle the remaining balance he owed, more than 2 decades after the marriage had ended. Throughout the long and difficult process, Loni made consistent choices about how she presented herself publicly. She moved her focus toward her son, toward her daughter Deidre, and toward the life she was building away from the spotlight. In 2008, she married folk singer Bob Flick, a founding member of the Brothers Four, a man she had actually met briefly at a movie premiere in Minneapolis way back in 1963. They had put that old photograph on their wedding cake decades later, a choice that captured something about the kind of love she had finally found. The truth Loni finally shared. In 1995, Loni Anderson published her autobiography, My Life in High Heels, and with it came the public statement she had been holding back for more than 2 years. She had waited, choosing to tell the story of her time with Burt with honesty but without hatred, because the relationship had been real and the love had been real, even as the damage it caused had also been real. What she put into the book was not a simple story of victimhood. It was a detailed and personal account of what it had been like to live inside that marriage. The autobiography traced the arc of her life from Minnesota to Hollywood, but the section covering her marriage to Burt Reynolds took up the largest portion of the book. She described a man who had started showing signs of possessiveness and irrational jealousy long before they were married, behavior that had been easy to misread in the early stages of a relationship defined by passion and public attention. She described the slow process by which that jealousy intensified inside the marriage, fed by the prescription pill dependency that had taken hold after his jaw injury. Loni described the physical attacks in specific terms. She said it happened on at least a dozen occasions during the marriage, and that in each instance she had found ways to explain away the evidence. There were bruises she covered with excuses about accidents. She told people she had fallen downstairs. She managed the narrative around her own body, the same way she managed everything else in that household. She carried those explanations for years because she believed, as many people in similar situations do, that the situation could still be salvaged if she simply held on long enough. The medication Burt had been prescribed had transformed his behavior in ways that made the home unpredictable and unsafe. Loni wrote about watching him move through days when he was almost unrecognizable, when the man who had once read books aloud with her in comfortable silence had been replaced by someone whose reactions to ordinary moments could turn without warning. He had also reportedly threatened to take his own life during one particularly frightening episode, telling Loni that he was afraid she was going to leave him. One of the most specific and disturbing incidents she revealed involved a loaded gun. In the month before Burt filed for divorce, the violence escalated to a point that Loni later described as the worst moment of the entire marriage. Burt shoved her repeatedly around a room, threw her to the floor, and then pulled out a loaded gun from a nearby drawer. He handed it to her and told her to use it on herself. Loni sat with that memory for years before she put it in print. When she did, she described it surrounded by the ordinary details of a day that had turned into something she could never have anticipated. Loni also addressed the safety of their son, Quentin. She had grown deeply concerned about Burt's erratic behavior around the boy, and she took deliberate steps to make sure Quentin was never alone with his father during periods when Burt's behavior was at its most unstable. She arranged for a nanny to be present during Quentin's visits to Burt in Florida. When the regular nanny refused to make the trip after Burt had thrown a chair at her during a previous visit, Loni arranged for a substitute to go in her place. The safety of her child wasn't something she was willing to compromise on, regardless of what that choice cost her in the ongoing custody dispute. Loni was also careful in the autobiography to acknowledge her own decisions along the way. She did not present herself as someone who had simply been trapped without agency. She wrote about the complexity of staying in a relationship that was causing her harm, and she described the seductive reasons that kept her there. Love, hope, the belief that she could be the person who helped Burt find his way back to himself. She had believed for a long time that if she held the household together with enough patience, the man she had fallen in love with in 1981 would return. In interviews she gave around the publication of the book, Loni spoke about wanting other women who had been through similar experiences to recognize themselves in what she had written. She said the question she heard most often, why would someone stay in a toxic relationship, was not a simple question. She described how the process of being worn down by someone you love happens slowly, in increments that are each individually manageable, until one day the entire structure of the relationship is built around managing the dangerous person at its center, rather than living a real life. Burt Reynolds, through his publicist, declined to comment on the specific allegations Loni made. His representative stated only that he wished her the very best going forward. Burt himself had denied the accusations of physically harming Loni in the past, and he continued to let that denial stand without elaboration. What Loni had put into My Life in High Heels now existed as a permanent record of her experience, detailed, named, and undeniable, regardless of whether anyone on the other side chose to respond to it. Peace in the end. In the years after the autobiography was published, Loni Anderson was asked repeatedly to summarize what had gone wrong in her marriage to Burt Reynolds. She gave many answers in many different settings, but across all of them, one thread remained consistent. The marriage had not failed because of competing schedules or clashing personalities, or the ordinary pressures that dissolve many Hollywood relationships. It had failed because of addiction, and because addiction had produced violence, and because she had spent years trying to absorb the consequences of both, before finally accepting that no amount of love or patience could fix what only Burt himself had the power to address. That clarity had taken time to arrive. Loni spent the early years of her life after the marriage focused primarily on Quentin, on keeping his relationship with his father as functional as it could be given the circumstances, and on rebuilding the parts of herself that the marriage had slowly worn away. She had emerged from the relationship with her dignity intact, but with a full understanding of how much she had given up over the years she had spent trying to keep the household from falling apart. That accounting was not something she shared publicly in terms of bitterness. It was something she had to do privately on her own terms before she could move forward. Quentin Anderson Reynolds grew into the role of mediator between his parents. He had been shaped by the difficult years of his childhood, but also by the love that both Loni and Burt had consistently expressed for him, even through the worst of their conflict. As he grew older, he worked to maintain a relationship with both parents and to hold space for the possibility that they could one day exist in the same room without the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on the moment. That effort eventually produced something that neither Loni nor Burt had expected.
Forget whatever happened to us, but that Quentin felt good about himself and the relationship he came into.
Before Burt Reynolds passed away in September 2018 from a heart attack at the age of 82, Quentin arranged a final dinner between his parents. Loni later described the evening with a kind of quiet wonder. Burt had shown up with flowers. They sat together and talked in the way that people who have shared a long and complicated history sometimes can, with the full weight of that history present but not dominating everything. Loni later said that there had always been a more thoughtful man underneath the public persona. That man had been there at the beginning, and she had caught a glimpse of him again that evening. What Loni had come to understand, and what she expressed in various interviews in the years before her own passing on August 3rd, 2025, was that the real reason the marriage ended was not one that could be reduced to a single dramatic moment or a single betrayal. The real reason was that she had been living with someone who was in the grip of a serious addiction, and that addiction had made it impossible for the marriage to be a safe or healthy place for either of them. She had loved Burt Reynolds for 12 years of her life, and she had spent a significant portion of those years trying to protect both her son and herself from the consequences of that addiction, while simultaneously trying to protect the man she loved from himself. After the divorce ended, the effects did not disappear, and instead, they stayed connected to both lives, shaping how people saw their careers, their personal choices, and their public image for many years. The story became part of their identity, and it stayed connected to their image in a way that was difficult to separate. The peace she eventually found was not the peace of someone who had forgotten what had happened, or who had decided to rewrite history into something easier to hold. It was the peace of someone who had told her story fully, who had walked through the outcome of that honesty, and who had chosen on the other side of all of it to let the anger go. She described herself and Burt as friends first and friends last, a framing that honored the genuine bond that had existed between them at the start, without requiring her to minimize what had come after. It was the most honest possible summary of something that had never been simple. Loni Anderson spent her final years surrounded by her family, her son, her daughter, her grandchildren, and her husband Bob Flick, who by all accounts gave her the stable and loving partnership she had always deserved. She had outlived the divorce, outlived the legal battles, and outlived Burt Reynolds himself. What she left behind was a record of someone who had endured considerable pain with considerable honesty, and who had found, in the end, that the truth was always worth telling, no matter how late.